I'll just make a quick comment. Like, I'll give an example. Like, in terms of the plan for restraint, I just want to share a personal example, just for me right now. Like, sometimes, like, you know, sometimes you can just say, well, I'll try not to do that, or I won't do it in this circumstance, or tomorrow I won't, whatever. But also sometimes, the reason why I say an action plan is like, I'll just give a personal example. Like, as I was thinking about my example of harsh speech, what came to mind to me was like, oh wow, sometimes, like, when people who it's not strangers, it's like people who I have a relationship with in some way or other, do something that bothers me, like, I want to seem nice, so I don't tell them. Like, oh, please don't do that. And if I don't tell them enough times, it bugs me after a while, and then it can come out like, oh, wow, why'd you do that? You know, like, sort of harsh. I was like, oh, wow, if I want to stop that, like, my plan for restraint would be, well, okay, when I notice that, I'm going to try to tell the person in a kind way sooner. Oh, listen, just so you know that bothers me, and say it nicely, then it's less likely to come out in a harsher way, right? So sometimes it's like I guess that's my point, is like, you have to really analyze for yourselves, like, what's a plan that'll work? You know what I mean? Like, and then to actually do it, you know what I mean, and to try it, and to say, okay, I'm going to do this to change. You know what I mean? But if you, and I guess I'll make one more point. That plan of restraint, remember I was saying one of the karmic results is the tendency to do the action again. Well, that's the one that purifies that, right? If you don't do the restraint, then you don't fix the tendency to do it again. So you have to really experiment with, how can I change that pattern? And you keep doing it until you find something that works, right? And where you don't do it, you know, where you change the behavior. So you get the idea there. Like, so, you know, so each time you have to come up with, like, okay, you know, like, let's say you do a purification and then you do a variation on it. It's a little different, but you do, you're like, oh, wow, I did something again that's similar. It's like, okay, well, what do I try now? How do I keep trying to do the restraint until I succeed at not in changing the behavior? You know? And eventually you can change any behavior, but it sometimes takes practice and trying different things. It's not like just because you did it once, it's necessarily easy to change, right? But if you keep trying, you know, every behavior arose due to causes and conditions. So if you change the things enough, eventually it changes.
Yeah, sometimes it's like in a plan, like what you're saying, sometimes it's like, well, it's the avoidance of something, like, okay, I'm going to avoid this because I know it makes me come up in this particular way. Like, I want to avoid watching, you know, 3 football games in a day instead of you know, something like that. Yeah, I mean,
no, that's right.
It's a plan, right?
That is a plan.
It is a plan. It's a real plan on Sundays.
Yeah.
Hey, well, it's actually, I mean, a lot of times, like, you know, so for example, I'll just go with what you said. Like, say the example of one of the 10 non-virtues is meaningless talk, right? But like, I mean, that's one where, like, there are certain circumstances where you could actually say to yourself, well, if I go there, everybody's talking meaninglessly, and I'll be rude if I don't, so I'm going to talk meaninglessly. And so there are certain circumstances where, like, well, you know, if I'm honestly going to refrain from that, I have to not be in that situation, because otherwise I will do meaningless talk. Or, you know, if you're with a group of people where everybody, like, I thought that also there's sometimes groups of people where everybody's, like, insulting each other. You know, and you're like, well, if I hang out with that group of people, I'm going to end up insulting, you know, either I would end up, you know, there's a really good chance I'm going to end up insulting somebody because that's what people do in that. And so it's like, well, okay, if I'm really going to change that behavior, I can't be there, you know. You know, sometimes that's just the reality, right? Like, you know, and so sometimes you do have to, like, kind of recognize that and say, yeah, the only way I can stop that behavior is changing the circumstance. And it doesn't mean you have to, like, you know, you might say, well, okay, well, instead of hanging out with that group of people, I'll call the one person and go see them one-on-one, and where it won't be that dynamic, or, you know, there are ways, I mean, it's not like you have to figure out for yourself, but to say that in this particular setting, and with this group of people, this always happens, and I'm not capable of changing the whole group, so, you know, like, yeah, so. You know, you may have to go like, okay, 3 doesn't, like, now 3 4 gives a 2, then if that's the work 1, then only the second half. No, I don't do
It's true. You gotta have a plan. You can't just say, I'm not doing this. You have to be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
You gotta have a plan. Otherwise, like, okay, wishy-washy is not gonna happen.
Yeah. And then you have to move to baseball or.
That's something different. He's replacing one sport.
That's not gonna help.
That's not gonna help.
But But yeah, even going back to your example earlier, from like if a person like if part of this pattern where when recognize, well, every time I'm tired, I'm overtired, I do this, then part of the power of restraint would be like, all right, well, what am I going to do this month to make myself less tired? And I'll try that. If that doesn't work, then next month I'll do something else, and I'll keep doing it until I find a way, like where I'm not so stressed out that then I can be more patient. And again, like my experience with that kind of thing is, sometimes the first thing works. Sometimes I try something and I go, wow, that really didn't work. I got to try something else. But to keep the key is like with the power of restraint is that you keep trying until you find something that works and then it changes, and or at least improves. Sometimes you do figure out something where wow, the whole thing changed. Sometimes it's like the Dalai Lama often points out. Sometimes you find something where you say, oh, it's 50% better now, or 25% better. Okay, I'm in the right direction now. How can I move it to 45%? Whatever. Sometimes it takes like a gradual process, but then if we can do that, we can say, all right, I'm headed in the right direction, and it gives you confidence to keep changing. Whereas the discouraging part is like if you don't really do that, you just it's like you go, wow, it's not really changed. That's like a really bad feeling, actually.
But Dr. Arnold, this would be more about dynamic part of you where some emotion comes in and you get into anger.
Yeah.
What about static things like addictions? People are addicted to alcohol, drugs. Does this same game plan help them, or is it like?
Yeah, actually, if you look at, I'll just share. So I wasn't going to say this, but I'll say it now because you asked. Actually, if you look at this process, one thing that's often struck me is that actually if you look at the specific dynamics of karma and what we're talking about in purification in particular, it's actually very similar, really, to the steps, to 12 steps. I mean, there's a whole part like, the refuge is similar to, that would be the Buddhist version of higher power. The sense of, the confronting and admitting the flaws and the harm that's done. The need for restraint, the need for, and the antidote. I mean, there's a thing of giving service. In 12 steps, you see people reaching a point where they realize they need to give back and offer service to others, and that part of the sobriety for themselves is helping others become sober. Is part of, it's like just like that. And so I guess my point is that now one thing with addiction is sometimes you need external support too. It's not enough to do it only on your own, but sometimes that's true with karma too. Actually, I mean, I'll say my own practice sometimes is like. In my own practice, sometimes I'm just doing it on my own. But if I'm struggling with one of these, like if I have a certain karma where I'm going, wow, I keep trying, but it's not really, no. I do the same thing somebody with addiction does, where I call up a friend. Whereas I say, hey, I'm struggling with this one. What do you think? And they'll say, well, have you tried this? Or, I noticed about you that maybe you didn't notice about yourself, that you tend to do that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. I didn't want to admit that. And sometimes it takes a good friend who's willing to point out, like, in a kind way, where they're not being mean, right? But they say, well, have you ever noticed that you do this? Oh, yeah, you're right. And I guess my point is that's what people with addiction often need. That is somebody external to point out things that one doesn't see. But I guess my point is that one would apply this exact same dynamic to addiction. But with addiction, of course, as with other things, sometimes you need more help than just only this. But actually, there are a group of people who who use these 4 powers in conjunction, for example, with the 12 steps in a 12-step program for addiction. And it's an excellent idea, because that really goes together quite well. And you can integrate these 4 powers into that overall program, for example. I think it's a great idea, honestly. That's my own personal input. I think it's great to do that. So I think these same points could be used. And with addiction, right, if you go through, well, what's the basis? What's the afflictive emotion? How do I, really analyzing why do I do that behavior? And what's the motivation there? Actually, people who are recovering from addiction have to do that anyway, really, and look through what are the environmental cues and what situation, just the same stuff we were talking about, right? If I put myself in this situation, I'm more likely to relapse and all that. So a lot of the process is actually the same. So I think it's a great to integrate, but I wouldn't only do it. If it's a serious addiction, I would say integrate these with other forms of help, like whether it's counseling or 12-step programs or whatever the person.
Is our reliance on prayer too, right?
Which
Because you
one?
can rely on prayer.
Oh yeah.
Like you're not alone. Rely on the Buddhas.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the refuge, right? That part of of those powers, right? Yeah, is turning for help to the.
Right.
Yeah, that's part of that. And I want to make one more point, and then we'll finish the Guru Puja in a second. I just want to make one more point to you guys, just because, because the purpose of these retreats, or these half-day, whatever, 3-hour things, is to help people with their practice. So I just want to say from my own experience, just sharing this also, like, that, you know, like, I mean, you know, we all have this, right? Like books like this, of Lam Rim, that are great. You should, you know, you need that, like, to remind yourself of what's in the teachings. But for me, I'll just say, like, what I find, and I didn't make this up, but my teachers told me this, like, it really, two things I want to say that really help. One is to pick a topic from the Lam Rim and stay with it for a period of time. Like, you know, so if you're going to meditate on karma, for example, or on refuge, or on impermanence, or whatever, like, it really helps to, like, stay with one topic for, you know, it's up to you. You can do one topic for a few weeks, or for a month, or for 2 months, and then move on to another topic if you want to. But you know, it's just doing it for a day doesn't, I don't think is enough to really help, but as much. I mean, it's good, anything's good, but my suggestion, I want to make two suggestions. One suggestion is, you know, pick a topic and stay with it for a while, then move on to another topic, you know, then you can go back, you know, whatever, like, that's one suggestion. And the other suggestion that I just personally find very helpful is, like, you know, having books there to look at, but having the outline in my own words, where I go through the book. That's what I do for these classes. You know, I write it down and sort of say, okay, these are the core points, and you know, and then being able to look back at that and say, you know, because the truth is, if you're trying to meditate and you have, you know, a book like this, and you're going to go, oh wait, what page is that on? And you're flipping back and forth. Well, you know, it doesn't allow you to deepen your inner process. So to sort of take all the key points from any one of the Lam Rim texts and sort of write them down in your own words, like, okay, what are the 4 powers? You know, you put it in your words. Or what are the 4 key points of karma? You know, like, you know, the karma's, again, like one text says karma's definite, another says karma's certain, another, you know, one says karma doesn't disappear, another said it doesn't dissolve, another says it doesn't go away over time. Like, pick a phrase that you like. They're all, you know, that reflects the meaning for you, that then you can contemplate the meaning. And even if you want, in the like, next to that, you know, write down your own, if there's a certain image that works for you, or if, like, you know, a certain metaphor that works for you, or a certain example from your own life that works for you, write it down. You know, this is for you. Does that make sense? Like, it's for your own practice. It's not for somebody else. So that's just my advice for practical purposes. And then even if you leave space, you can even write in other things. Let's say because that's my experience. If I meditate on a certain, even if I've done it before, like, I have something to go back through the Lam Rim, right? And if I pick a topic and say, okay, I'm going to meditate on this for a month. Like, my honest experience is that, like, even if I've meditated on many times before, if something new comes, you know, like, if I do it for a whole month, I'll be like, oh, wow, I never thought of it from this angle before, or I didn't relate it to this part of my life before, you know, and then, like, to write a note for yourself about that, like, oh, wow, I never, you know, like, and that's really helpful. Does that make sense? And it's very personal, and that you can't get from a book, because it's only your own thing. I remember a few months ago I was doing that, where I was meditating again on the very first point of Lam Rim, right, which is devotion to the teacher, and, like, I was meditating on that, and all of a sudden I was like, oh wow, like, I suddenly had this insight, like, oh wow, how I related. Sometimes I sort of have been, like, stuff from my childhood about my parents, I was sort of putting onto my teachers. I was like, oh, that's not about them, that's about my own trip. And I was like, that has nothing to do with them. And I was like, oh, I'm so glad to see that. You know, I wrote it down to remember it. I was like, oh wow, I just never noticed that before. How this particular way, I sort of was like expecting them to be a certain way because that was the way I grew up. And I'm like, that's not about my guru, that's the way I grew up. That's nothing to do with this topic. And I was like, oh, what a relief to see that, you know, and like, and the next time, if I do it for a month again, there'll be some other insight. And that's how it should be. You know? So I guess I'm just saying, to have your own place where you sort of, that's different from you have your books. And for me, if I'm doing that, then, you know, let's say I'm meditating on a certain topic a lot, like, and then if I reach a point where I'm like, okay, there's something about this one I want to look up in the book, then I'll pull out the book in between, and for the next day, like, I'll look at it and read it, and then go back, put the book away again, and go back to meditating. You know, so I would consider it both. You know, like, you have the books there to sort of refer to every now and then, but your own outline to sort of, let's say it, you know, so that you're deepening your own process.
Personalization.
What is it?
Personalization.
Yeah, personalization. Yeah, exactly. It's personalized.